Hey guys, what's going on? This is Pete, aka Characters, and welcome to my Basics of 6 Max teaching series for PokerStars School. In this series, we're going to basically give you a gentle intro into the format of 6 Max Cash. So if you're someone who normally plays live and you're thinking about playing online, or you play full ring, or you play tournaments, or spin and goes, or whatever, and you're thinking about trying out this format, I definitely recommend it. It's a very fun format of the game. There's a lot of action, a lot of strategy, a lot of battling other players. It's just a load of fun, and I'm going to show you guys exactly how we should approach it from a basic standpoint. So in this series, we're going to be doing 10 episodes of about 20 to 25 minutes each, and in each episode we're going to be going through a topic running from opening ranges and just opening the pot like we're going to cover today, all the way through to 3-betting, 4-betting, facing continuation bets, bluffing, building strategies in some spots and things like that. We're not going to get too advanced in this series. We're going to keep it nice and basic, but we are going to cover everything to a fairly comprehensive level. It's just that we're not going to go into huge detail yet. So this is not a series that's going to equip you to like play at the highest stakes or anything like that, but it will give you a very solid foundation to sort of enter the games at the lowest stakes if you've not played them before, and build a solid game that you can use to hopefully be successful and build upon in the future. So let's get into it. Today, we're going to start with opening the pot, and I'm going to begin with a definition of that before we get into these points below. So, opening the pot, by that I mean actually open raising, so raising as the first player into the pot. It could be that we are first to act under the gun, or it could be that a bunch of players have actually folded to us, but either way, there's been no limp before us. We're going to cover that next time. There's been no raise before us. That would be a 3-bet decision that we'll cover in a few episodes' time. We're basically going to be just starting off nice and simple as the first player to make a raise. And it's very important in 6 Max Cash actually that you don't open limp. Limping as the first player into the pot, it can be viable in very passive full ring games where multi-way family pots are very, very commonplace. If you're a live player and you play like 1-2 live and stuff in some passive games, you'll be very used to that actually happening and open limping being okay. But in 6 Max Cash, it's not something we're ever going to do. The games are just simply too aggressive for it to be a viable strategy. So we're going to start off always raising when we come into the pot. That's going to be our strategy. Okay, let's look at the 6 Max table first of all before we get into those other points about reasons to raise and raise sizing. The 6 Max table looks like this. We have 6 positions, funnily enough. It's not always full. Sometimes the 6 Max table will be 3-handed, 4-handed, 5-handed, and these are really cool, like fun situations as well that almost deserve entire video series to themselves, but I'll touch on them lightly here. The first seat we can see here is actually a blue seat. It's under the gun, and the color coding here is that a blue seat is an early position seat. A red seat is a steal position, and the black seat there is the big blind, which is kind of in a category of its own. We can't actually open raise from the big blind because we can only have a decision to make there when someone else has not folded. So when someone else has called or someone else has raised. If everyone folds to us, we win the hand. Nice, end of story. That's called a walk, but it's not what we're talking about here. So we won't be discussing playing out of the big blind at all in this video because you can't open from the big blind. We will be looking at the other positions. Early position, you play tighter ranges. You have more people to act after you. You have less fold equity. You have less chance of stealing the blinds. And you're more likely to encounter 2 or 3-way pots because there's simply more players to act. That's why our ranges need to be stronger. We need to have hands that can actually stand up, frequently having to see the flop, often from out of position, because if you look here under the gun, 3 of the 5 players behind us actually have position on us, so we'll quite commonly be out of position when we open from that seat. From the hijack, 2 players do, and from the cutoff, just 1. So why is there a big divide there between the hijack and the cutoff? Why does it suddenly split? Well, there's a big difference actually, just exponentially, between there being 3 players to act after you and 4 players to act after you. So when we're in the hijack there, which is the seat to the left of under the gun, 2 of the people to act after us actually have position on us, and there's 4 players still in the pot. That makes it a lot harder to achieve fold equity, to thin the field, to do a lot of good stuff there, and we need a much stronger hand than we do in the cutoff, the position to its left. In the cutoff, we just have the button to worry about who has position on us, and there's only 3 players to act. So I'd say the biggest kind of increase in opening range happens in those seats, like between the hijack and the cutoff. But of course, the button is even wider still than the cutoff. Let's take a look at some opening kind of rough percentages, just to give you guys an idea how wide we can actually raise here, so what kind of hands we can open. Under the gun, I'm going to recommend a fairly tight strategy for a beginner. This can be adapted as the table becomes softer, as there are more weaker players, particularly in the blinds. We can make this even wider still. But generally here will be somewhere between the range of 12 to 15% of hands. We'll be at the lower sort of end of that when we're dealing with a less favourable table, and we'll be at the higher end of that when we're dealing with a more favourable table. So it's probably worth pausing at this point just to ask, what makes a table favourable to open? Like, when do I want to be at that 15% and when do I want to be down at that 12%? Well, it's going to depend on the skill of the players behind us, how often they like to re-raise us, or 3-bet us as we'd say, and how often they like to call. The more fold equity we have, that's to say the more people are just going to fold and let us play heads up or win the blinds, the wider we can open. And if we have weaker players who we really want to sort of play pots with, because they're likely to give us their money, right? If we have them out of position to us, i.e. in the blinds, then we can open more hands. So that's really our criteria for where we want to sit on that 12 to 15% range, but it's a snug range, it's tight, and it will expand massively as we move around the table, as we're about to see. In the hijack, we bump this right up to 15 to 21% of hands. This involves opening sort of every pair, a lot of hands like suited aces, some good suited connectors now, like 8-9 suited, 10-9 suited get into the range. I'd recommend getting like a range builder program and just sort of dragging the bar up to see what 15% of hands looks like, what 21% of hands looks like, and just get a feel for that. But in the hijack, we'll be opening like most pairs, a lot of suited aces, all the suited broadways, a lot of offsuit broadways. We're just widening up what we were opening under the gun, and for good reason. There's now one less player to act who has position on us, so our range increases slightly, and again, we have a wide margin here of 6%, just to account for all the different kinds of tables that we might face. But we are kind of limited by the amount of players behind us. It's never going to be okay to open like 40% from the hijack. Some people call the hijack MP, middle position as well, which is also viable, so you'll hear that seat referred to in a couple of different ways. In the cutoff, things, like I said, they start to open up the most for like the first time. There's a big difference now with only having one player who has position on us, and especially where that button player is very tight, that's where we're allowed to really step out of the box a lot and open more towards 35% of hands. Personally, I always end up opening at least 30% in the cutoff unless I'm on a table where people are being very 3-betty. If they deny me the actual opportunity to see the flop, that makes it a lot worse for me to open. That deters me. That drives me back down towards that 25% part of that range. But where the button's tight, where the small blind is tight, the big blind isn't 3-betting much, or I've got a weaker player in the big blind I want to play a pot with in position, I'll widen that right up. I'll open 35%. You might even see me opening King 5 suited in the cutoff, or 8-6 suited if the conditions are right, or even 10-9 offsuit. But I'll always open hands like Jack 10 suited, Jack 9 suited, Ace 5 suited, King Jack off. These will just always be in my range from that seat, basically no matter what. On the button, we really start to have fun. This is where we get our kind of bread and butter earnings. We take down the blinds. That supports us over the long run. It really boosts our win rate. It just gives us the fuel that we need to survive in the game, because we have to post the blinds ourselves. And we'll talk a bit more about the tax of paying the blinds and how to negate it a little bit later. But the main way that we do that is by stealing on the button. This is a very lucrative spot, and the post-flop, we have position all the time. But gives us a huge edge. It just means that even if our hand strength is kind of inferior to our opponent's range, we can still survive, and we can do very well just because we get to act last, control the size of pots, we get to do a lot of stuff, maximize value, minimize losses, be the one in charge of how much money goes in, where and when. That's the really cool thing about the button, guys. We want to play a wide range here. One of the biggest mistakes you see from like beginning players is to only open about 20, 25, 30% on the button. It's not enough. Your button opening range needs to be really, really wide in this game, because that's where a lot of your money comes from. And in 6-max cash, there's only 3 players to actually act before you when you get to the button, so it does fold to you on the button very often. So making sure that you steal a lot from that position makes a big difference to your win rate, and you will see me open on some tables hands as bad as like 7-6 offsuit. On other tables, I might tighten it up, and the bottom of my range might be like Ace 5 off for 8-6 suited or things like that, 7-5 suited, whatever. You get the point. I don't want to build hand charts today. I'm not a believer in like, this is a hand chart you should follow blindly. I'm a believer in teaching 6-max cash, and that you understand the reasons for why you're doing things, and you understand like the rough kind of boundaries for things and why they apply, and how to actually modify them based on who's at the table. Like the heart and soul of poker is making adjustments compared with like who is ahead of you, how you expect them to act. That's the fun part. So don't stick to rigid hand grids. That's why we're not looking at those today, if you're wondering. Small blind, 35 to 60%. This is a very wide kind of margin here, and that's because there's only one guy to act. So who that player is now extremely important. If that's a really tight player, I might open 80%. I might open 100% of hands just to take his blind. Because it fuels me over the long run. It gives me so much profit over the long run to do that successfully. If that's someone who attacks a lot, who defends, who uses position well, I'll be more down at the 35 to 40 kind of percent of that range. So you may catch me opening a hand like Queen 4 here if you're too tight. But if you're playing well and you're defending your big blind enough, then I won't be opening hands like that. And I'll be opening, a lot more strength than that in general. It won't be like super tight here because there's only one guy to act after me. So we do have to make sure we still steal a lot here and we still play a lot of hands. But we need to be conscious of the fact that we're out of position now. If that player in the big blind does want to use his position well and apply pressure to us, we will suffer here if we go too wide. So that 60% range there, it's not defensible against someone playing optimally. It's not good against someone playing well, but it is good against people who are too tight, who either fold too much before the flop or maybe fold too much after the flop to that continuation bet that you make. So 35 to 60, very wide range, but so it should be because it's a very wide array of potential opponents that you can encounter in this spot. Let's move on to reasons to raise now. It's very important that we understand why we're doing things in 6-max cash. It's not enough just to learn and copycat other strategies. We want to actually be able to say, I know why I'm doing this. I know how it relates, in particular to my expected value. How well you expect to do over the long run when you make a play is all down to the reasons of why or why not you should make that play. So that's why I'm very reason orientated as a coach, and why my video series here is going to contain loads of reasons for you guys so you know why you're doing what you're doing. Thinning the field is maybe the number one reason to raise from early position. Remember in that table we had the blue seats, the hijack and under the gun, and in those seats there's a lot of people to act after us, and it's in our interest there to definitely trim down the people we're going to see the flop with. Make sure it's not like a mass multi-weight pot, because we open hands like this under the gun, right? So imagine we pick up this lovely hand under the gun and raise to 3 big blinds, which is standard size for this position. More about that later. Why is that better than limping? Like, what's the main thing that we're gaining? It's really about thinning the field. So there are a lot of flops that can come down after we raise, but on a lot of them, on a fairly big majority of flops, we're going to have an overpair. Like, there will be even better flops like this for us, like 5-5 deuce or queen XX. And there'll be worse flops for us, like ace XX, ace king 3, king jack 3, whatever. Or 7-6-5, all the one suit. That's not great. But in general, the flop is likely to be fairly dry like this, fairly sort of innocuous. Like, most flops are fairly uncoordinated. It's rare to get flops that are like really bad for queens. So in general, we'll have one pair. Most of the time that will be an overpair, and that's a very good hand. So the strong hands we can flop with queen are usually overpairs. These are very powerful, but not invincible hands, and are best far more often in a heads-up pot than they are 4-way. 3-way pots are obviously in between. They're not terrible, but they're not great. When it starts to go like mass multi-way, like 4 or 5-way, queen starts to suffer here, because although it is the best hand still more often than not in a 4-way pot, there's more chance now that we'll run into a set, we'll run into 2-pair, we'll run into a straight, or that someone will make one of those hands on the next card. So thinning the field pre-flop is really all about limiting the opposition to 1 or 2 players so that your big hand that's ahead of their ranges can stay ahead, so that it can remain in good shape and it can get value later. There's another reason here as well on that note of value, which is that it's easier to extract value post-flop with 1-pair hands in smaller fields. Think about that. So why is it when there's less players on the flop it's easier for us to value bet? Well, in general, we need more strength to bet in multi-way pots. So that restricts the number of hands we can actually value bet with. Pocket 9s here in a 5-way pot is nowhere near as big on this flop as it would be heads up. Same thing with queens, although it's a bit better. So our aware opponents know this. They know that we need more strength to bet multi-way. So we fire that c-bet in a 3 or 4-way pot here. They're more reluctant to call large bets with only 1 pair. It's harder for us to get action, in other words, from a hand like pocket 7s, pocket 9s, 8-7, etc. over multiple streets in a multi-way pot. Moreover, we're hardly ever going to get floated by some really light hand. It might be heads up. Our opponent calls our flop c-bet with queen jack of clubs. That's great for us. That's not going to happen in a four-way pot. So the more we can thin the field pre-flop with strong hands in early position, the better it is for us. One, because the hands remain good more often, like these overpairs or top pair with ace-king. Whatever it happens to be, these one-pair hands are powerful, but they're not invincible. And secondly, we get more value in heads-up and three-way pots with one-pair hands. Sets like to be three-way, sure. If you have like pocket sixes on this board, you wouldn't mind being in a four-way pot, but we're not talking about that kind of hand here. We're talking about bigger hands that more commonly have, not nutted hands like sets, but big hands like overpairs, top pairs. These hands want to be heads up wherever possible. Reason 2 for opening the pot is value. Let's imagine that we're in the cutoff now, so the first of our steal positions from that 6-max table, and we find ourselves dealt this promising hand. We raise to 3 big blinds, and a small blind who has been noted to be loose and passive, just the kind of opponent you want to play against, right? A loose passive small blind makes a lot of mistakes, he calls too many hands, doesn't raise enough, doesn't fold enough, gives you value. So this hand, King Jack here, okay, it's not the nuts, it's not a monster per se, but it is a hand that's going to do very, very well against someone that plays too loose and too passive. So we raise the 3 big blinds, and this raise is mainly for value, because there are a lot of flops that this hand connects well with. It's not that we'll always flop top pair, we won't do that more than about a third of the time, but we will flop other things as well, like second pairs that can be good. We can flop draws that can improve to very, very strong nutted hands. And in general, King Jack it'll be dominating our opponent's range. He'll have hands that are King X or Jack X, that's to say they contain a Jack or a King, but they're weaker than our hand. So he can often flop worse top pairs here, second pairs, middle pairs, that kind of thing. And on boards like this, which is not every flop, I'm not saying we always flop Jack 4-3, but on a lot of flops we can then get value. So the very fact that we've built that pot before the flop was super important. So that's another reason to raise pre-flop, is to actually build a pot with a good hand so that later in the hand, more money can go in. And one of the biggest mistakes that people make, like beginning players make, is that they end up not building pots soon enough, and therefore they can't bet enough later. So on flops like this, the pot is now larger due to our raise. That's the key point here. We've built that flop already, like preemptively, almost in anticipation of flopping well against a bad player. We now have the scope to build a large pot for value with a hand that figures to be in excellent shape versus our weak opponent's range. And here's my disclaimer, like I'm not saying that you need the opponent to be a weak player for this to be a good value raise. This is a good value raise against almost anyone, because in the big blind people will call hands worse than this, a lot of them. It's just that it's even better for us when we know our opponent is kind of weak and passive. That just helps the cause further. It's a very stark example just to prove the point. So by raising this hand pre-flop, we isolated the small blind. That's kind of going back to thinning the field again. And we can now take full advantage if he calls down too loosely with no one else in the pot to interfere. So there is definitely some field thinning going on in this kind of spot as well. There's less of it, because in the cutoff there's not so many people to act. But I guess the main reason for raising is not quite field thinning, though it is important, but it's value. It's building a pot so that we know that when we flop well with a good hand, we can take down the pot, or maybe we can even make continuation bets when we miss and take down the pot as well if villain plays quite fit or fold. So all of that gives us value, although the main definition of value is getting paid off by worse hands. Number 3, and the most important, yet most alien, for someone who's played like live full ring, is stealing the blinds. When you play live games, when you play tournaments is a lot of stealing, right? So if you're a tournament player, you'll be very familiar with this. But if you're coming over to 6-max cash from formats like full ring, like low stakes live and stuff like that, where there's not a whole lot of folding going on in the first 5 seats, it's not going to get folded to you in late position very often, and this will be a little bit alien. But stealing the blinds at 6-max cash is like the most familiar thing in the world. It's bread and butter. It's where most of the money comes from. Let's imagine we're on the button and we look down at this modest hand. In the blinds we see 2 tighter regulars, who hate to play out of position and do not defend their blinds much. We raise to 2 big blinds. Seems good, right? We have a 7-5, we don't have a miserable hand, we have a hand with some potential, but certainly value is not the reason that we're raising now. It's not a big hand, it doesn't figure to flop lots of good dominating top pairs like the King Jack did in the previous slide. It's also not to thin the field, because the field is already thinned by the simple fact that 3 people folded to us. We're on the button, remember? So we don't need to thin the field either. Really what we're doing here is we're just trying to pick up a pot. A small pot, but one that we can pick up regularly to really boost our win rate. Because being in the blinds, you guys should see this as like a poker tax. Like, that is the way the game gets action going, is to make you post blinds. If there were no blinds in poker, there'd be very little action. Everyone would wait for aces. It would be the most dull, boring game ever. The fact that there is this incentive out there to get people raising, for people to win, it means a lot. And just because it's not very much money, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't go after it, because if you could be given $1 a minute for the rest of your life, okay, it's only $1, but every minute for the rest of your life, you would take that deal, right? That's a lot of money, and that's the way you should see stealing the blinds. It's really just about picking up small pots very, very frequently and keeping yourself afloat. So we have to post these blinds like twice in orbit, 1 out of 3 times in a 6-max game, maybe more. If you're short-handed, you'll be posting a blind. That's a big, big drain on your win rate. It really makes it difficult to profit unless you recoup your losses. So we incur significant losses simply by being dealt a poor hand, and if we are to become successful 6-max cash game players, this money must be recouped, and this is done by stealing. The button is the epitome of stealing. You're in position, you have an aura of invincibility about you. After the flop, you will make every decision after your opponent, meaning you'll have the power of information, pot control, you'll get more value, you'll lose less when you're behind, you'll choose where and when money goes into the pot. Position's super important, everyone knows that, not everyone understands why. So all of those things equate to position being amazing. So when we're on the button, we can do what we want to an extent. Now, if there are people in the blinds that are still active and 3-betting and protecting themselves, we do need to be careful. But in a spot like this, where the blinds are very tight, we can certainly raise 7-5, giving ourselves a great price on this steal, only making it very small to pick up the blinds, and this should be very, very profitable. So by regularly picking up the blinds pre-flop from the steal positions, we can negate the poker tax and sustain a healthy income from small pots. Stealing is essential in the long term. I can't stress that enough, guys. Seriously, it's the nuts. It's everything in 6-max cash. Steal the blinds within reason. Don't do it so wide that you become a target, but do it wide enough that you sustain a good win rate just by picking up small pots. Open sizing. So we've learned why we raise. We've learned roughly what kind of hands we're going to do it from and why in different positions in the table. We're going to wrap up today's video by talking about what sizing we're going to use. Let's start off with 3x or 3 big blinds. You'll hear both of these expressions. They mean the same thing. 3x means 3 times the previous bet, whether that's the big blind or whether that's someone else's raise, and 3 BBs means literally 3 big blinds. In this spot, because the big blind and the previous bet are one and the same thing, 3x and 3 big blinds are the same thing, right? But we're gonna use the terminology BBs and not X today. So here we're under the gun, and this is proper under the gun, not just first to act, but we are actually that seat that is 3 away from the button, right? That is the definition of under the gun, right? We have ace-jack off, which is a hand that we will normally play on all but the least favourable tables, because that does fall in our sort of 12 to 15% range that we defined earlier on. Remember that? So it falls in there. So we're going to open it. And really the reasons, to recap those that we're opening here, are thinning the field, primarily. When we're opening from early position, that thinning the field reason is always going to kind of be top dog. But also for value, and we can see here that we've got a loose cutoff, whatever that means. Could be anywhere from like a fairly out of line player to someone that's just completely out of control, or it could just be someone that slightly likes to cold call more, whatever. We've just noticed that they're a bit loose. We don't know yet the extent of it, and we've got a gambler in the big blind. So gambler is the kind of player type who is not really playing poker isn't really playing poker to try to play well or learn strategy or anything like that, but it's more so in the game just to try to have fun, to win pots, to throw money around and enjoy himself. So against this kind of player, we can expect that it won't take very much for this guy to want to actually enter the pot. This guy's going to want to come along really frequently, and so by making it 7, what we're doing here is we're actually trying to thin the field so that we just get to play with him. It's like isolation, right? So here we need to thin the field and hopefully play heads up with the big blind, and our large sizing helps us achieve this. And it does it more often when there's 5 players still to act. So with 5 players more to act, we need to size up in anticipation of people wanting to call, or if there being a kind of domino effect of one player calling, and another player thinking, oh, well, that's a good price now, and then the gambler coming along as well. We want that gambler guy to ourselves. We want him out of position to us in a heads-up pot so that we can do well and hopefully in the long term earn a lot of money from his mistakes, right? So 7 here is a good size. It's 3.5 BBs, 3.5x, and it sets out to thin the field. By making it larger with a strong dominating hand, we increase our expected value versus big blind's wide range. Also, it's for value, right? By making it bigger, we build a bigger pot in which we can bet bigger later and win more money. With even just top pair, could be a huge hand against this guy who wants to throw money around and just have fun. We want to discourage the loose cutoff from also entering the pot. We know there's a threat of that player coming along because they're looser, so we try and deter them from doing it preemptively. We kind of just take that measure in advance by raising more than we normally would here. A standard size under the gun would be 3. Here we've gone 3.5 for those reasons. Use larger sizing when your opponents call too much and when thinning the field is a high priority. When to use 2.5 BB. So this is like your kind of middle ground sizing, going 2.5. Have a look at this spot. Fold, fold from under the gun and hijack, and Hero finds himself in the cutoff with a very nice hand in the cutoff. Cutoff's a favourable position. It's the first of our steal seats. So when we've got 10-9 suited, it's a much better hand to have here than it would be under the gun or in the hijack. So from the cutoff, there are only 3 players left out behind us. So thinning the field is still relevant, but it takes less muscle now than it does from under the gun. When we are under the gun, we have to raise more. In the last hand, we made it $7, 3.5 big blinds, because we felt that there were a lot of players to get through. There was a chance of a domino calling effect. There was a loose player. There was a gambler in the big blind. Here, this is not the case. We have regulars in the blinds who are generally tight aggressive. They don't flat that much. They understand that they should be careful how wide they call, especially from out of position. So we don't need to do too much to get the job done here. 5 should do. And by making it 2.5, we actually leave a lot of money behind. And this allows us to defend more easily to 3 bets. And that's a kind of weird concept, but basically, there'll be more money that we can win from villain stack. The less that we make it pre-flop, the more money that stays behind in the stack, which is really good for a lot of the hands in our range. So if we want to call small blinds 3 bet, which might be to like $15 or $20, having more money relatively left behind gives us a better price to do so, because it means if we hit 2 pair here, hit a flush, hit a straight, we're getting paid off more relative to that investment that we're having to make. So in late position, you're more likely to get attacked when you open, right? Because people think you're stealing. So you're going to get 3 bet more often when you open in late position. So it definitely makes sense to keep your sizing down. That also means that when we have a weaker part of our opening range, like say we had ace 4 off here, which I might open, or I don't know, like king 10 off, or just a weaker hand, or less suitable hand to call a 3 bet with, we can fold it and only lose $5 rather than 7. So it would be a big mistake to actually go $7 in this situation, even though it was fine in the last hand. And that shows you there is a big difference between where and when to use different sizes. This is a good spot to just go $5 for these reasons. So in summary, use 2.5 big blinds as a compromise between thinning the field, because there is still some thinning of the field to do here. There are 3 players behind. We don't want to go 3-way. Even with this hand, we don't. We'd rather keep the pot heads up. We can win it more often that way. And giving yourself a good price on a steal. Like I say, you will get 3 bets sometimes. You'll lose less when you fold to it. And you'll give yourself more odds, more money behind, more implied odds, we'd call that, to defend to the 3 bet. So very good reasons to go smaller here than we did in the last hand. Finally for today, when do we use this cheeky little min open? When do we go 2 big blinds? When is that good? You'll see that sometimes, and beginning players might think, oh, that's a mistake. Like it's just not getting enough money in the pot. And it is in a lot of situations, but there is a time and a place for it for sure. Let's have a look at when that is. So here we've got ace 3 off. Not a very good hand, but one that in the button when we're playing, remember we're playing that 40 to 60% range, aren't we? So we're going to be opening a lot of wider hands, as we saw in the first couple of slides. So here we have 2 regs ahead of us. How do regulars play? They tend to be a bit more tight aggressive. They tend to 3 bet a lot more, especially at lower stakes. Like I wouldn't recommend playing 1-2 online, by the way. After watching these videos, that's actually quite high. Start off a bit lower when you're starting off with 6 max cash for sure. But we're just using this as an example because it's much easier to follow than like 10 cent, 25 cent. It's a little bit clunky, you know. It's nice to just put it into $1, $2. So we go 4. They're generally going to be 3 betting us a fair amount. So on the button, although we do have just 2 players to get through, right, and a lot of fold equity, So we don't have to thin the field so much here. And this 2 big blind raise gives us a very cheap steal. And this keeps our required fold equity, which we call RFE, down. Required fold equity is how much we need them to fold to break even on the steal. It's a percentage, right? And the smaller we go, the better the price we lay ourselves, the less we risk. It's all risk and reward here, right? So the less money we risk, the less often they actually need to fold for us to do well. If we went really big here and raised to $40, we would need them to fold almost all the time just for that to be reasonable in any way. So that's why we keep our price down here. There's only 2 players to get through. We're not thinning the field. 2 big blinds works well. If they call a lot, we can up it, right? We can go 2.5x, 3x, etc. If we get 3-bet frequently by the regulars behind, which we will in tougher games for sure, we will lose the minimum if we hold a part of our range that wants to fold to that 3-bet. So this hand here, ace-3, you can think ahead here a bit that if we open this and face a 3-bet, we probably do want to fold to it, so we save the minimum. We risk the minimum, we save a lot of money there by not making our open too big. Thinning the field is now unnecessary. We shall play a multi-way pot very rarely. Anyway, like the field is already thinned by those 3 folds there. We don't have to worry about it. Okay guys, that is the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed our intro to 6 max cash on opening, and you now understand the reasons, the sizings, the various approaches from each position, and I'm more familiar with the 6 max table. Next time we're going to move on to spots where somebody has actually limped and talk about isolating, and I'll show you guys a cool concept I actually wrote in one of my books that I used to explain it. So stay tuned, keep watching the series, and you will get a lot better at 6 max cash. Jump into the games, have fun, try out these opening strategies. I'll see you next time. Best of luck at the tables. See you soon.